Good morning. It is Sunday, April the 5th. I'm Velshi, and here are the facts. There are now 310,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 here in the United States. 8,405 people have died. New York continues to be the hardest hit, reporting 630 deaths and nearly 11,000 new cases in just one day. In total, 3,565 people have died in New York, and more than 4,000 remain in intensive care. Yesterday, with 4 days to go before New York runs out of ventilators, Oregon came to New York's aid with a massive gift of generosity, 140 ventilators.
Which is, I tell you, just astonishing and unexpected. And I want to thank Governor Brown. I want to thank all of the people in the state of Oregon for their thoughtfulness. Again, this was unsolicited. First, it was a kind gesture. I know Governor Brown, and she is a kind person, but it's also smart from the point of view of Oregon. Why? Because we're all in the same battle here.
In New York City, there are 69,606 confirmed cases of COVID-19. Joining me now, NBC News correspondent Corey Coffin. She is at the Army Field Hospital set up in New York's Central Park. Corey, it is a surreal situation at Central Park. Take us inside and tell us what's going on.
Yeah, surreal, bizarre, all of these words apply here this morning. Allie, it's a beautiful spring morning out here. Normally, we wouldn't have the sidewalk all to ourselves. Normally, we'd have runners, bicyclists, people walking their dog. We'd have on the lawn here, you know, people exercising or playing games. It is just such a different scene. It's not at all what New Yorkers expected coming out of winter and coming out of this long winter, no doubt. What I will point out, though, is you can see on the ridge behind me, there are some runners, some bicyclists up there because this is just one portion of Central Park that is blocked off for this makeshift hospital here. All of this being put together in concert with Mount Sinai, which is across the street right here. Samaritan's Purse getting up and running April 1st. Allie, there are 68 beds. That includes 10 ICU beds and 10 ventilators, and the need is great. What we're hearing is that they're currently treating some 30 patients behind me right now, with 5 of them in intensive care, 5 of them needing those ventilators. And this really did start as a way to provide some overflow beds from the hospital. Obviously, it was greatly needed because they've already got it half filled. They also say on Friday they had 8 ambulances standing by waiting to get the coronavirus patients inside here. So they are filling up the beds very quickly. And even though this is kind of a bizarre sight, this is the first time the Samaritan's Purse has done anything like this in the United States, and this is certainly new for a lot of New Yorkers out here as they come walking by, also wearing their masks in public. It's certainly not new for Central Park. There was a general hospital built here in the 1800s that was a little bit further north of where we are here right now. But this need is only going to grow larger, and we're going to see if they're going to need to add any beds because the 68 will likely get filled up, they estimate, by this week, Allie.
Corey Coffin, thank you. Stay safe out there. NBC News correspondent Corey Coffin reporting live from a field hospital set up in New York City's Central Park. In addition to those 140 ventilators sent from Oregon, Governor Cuomo also announced that China is sending 1,000 ventilators to New York. Now, this comes just 2 days after a Russian military cargo plane arrived at New York's JFK airport full of supplies. Now, a high-ranking German official, the Berlin state minister, is accusing the United States of, quote, an act of modern piracy after the U.S. intercepted a shipment of 200,000 3M face masks in Thailand that were en route to a German police department. With the Trump administration still saying desperate U.S. states should continue to bid against each other and against FEMA on the private market, things are likely to continue to get worse.
You know, the federal government says the stockpile is about 10,000, moves a little bit, but let's say it's 10,000. That's for the nation. That's for the nation. So there's no place, there's no repository that is going to have everything that we need.
We should not be competing on the marketplace for tests and gowns and masks in this difficult time. We don't have the power or the resources to compete with New York City. We can't. If New York buys masks for $7, we can't buy masks for $8 or $9. We can't do that. It means that we go without.
Meanwhile, the pace of the outbreak in America continues to be alarming. As you can see, the number of reported cases is rising far faster when compared to other countries. The U.S. is the yellow line right at the top. Here's how the president described the situation yesterday.
This will be probably the toughest week between this week and next week, and there'll be a lot of death, unfortunately.
Joining me now is Dr. Rob Davidson. He's an emergency room physician in Spring Lake, Michigan. He's the executive director of the Committee to Protect Medicare. And in New York City, the host of the Dean Obeidallah Show on Sirius XM. Dean Obeidallah, he's a columnist as well for the Daily Beast. Gentlemen, good morning and welcome to you. Dr. Davidson, these briefings at the White House continue to have conflicting information. Dr. Fauci had said a couple of days ago that Americans should start wearing masks, not to protect themselves, but to protect other people from the spread of the disease. The president immediately said, oh, I'm not going to wear a mask in the Resolute desk in the Oval Office in case I have to meet a dictator. Puzzling that he would choose a dictator as the example. And again, he continues to say America's got to get up and running when we haven't even peaked in a place like New York. How are we supposed to deal with the conflicting information that's coming out right from that one place?
I tell you, it's frustrating me as much. Yesterday, I caught a briefing while I was dinner for my family, and a little video about it. He's talking about hydroxychloroquine, an untested drug that we doubt that actually works. You know, but I think we need Dr. Fauci, other professionals, and governors who are giving us conflicting conferences and in this time.
Dr. Davidson, I'm just going to hang on for a second. We're having trouble with your audio, so I want to just see if our control room might be able to fix that. I'm going to bring Dean in. Dean, what do you make of what's going on this week? You would think that 2.5 months into the first case in the United States, we'd have some consistency from the White House, but we're still arguing about ventilators, where they are. Earlier this week, you saw Jared Kushner come up. Apparently, he's in charge of something here, saying it sort of seemed a little like a Marie Antoinette thing. There are enough ventilators. Those who say there aren't are not really telling the truth. Fend for yourselves.
You know, I just want to give some perspective. You know, we had 630 New Yorkers die yesterday from this virus. During the flu season, on average, about 33 New Yorkers die from the flu. So I hope that makes a contrast on how lethal this virus is. And Ali, we can't expect a change in tone from Donald Trump or them having his son-in-law go out there. Trump is Trump. You know, only imagine if 2 months ago Donald Trump said what he said yesterday to the country. We're going to go through a difficult time. We're going to invoke the Defense Production Act to ensure we have ventilators and personal protection equipment that we need from across the country. We're going to have private companies make it so that today we'd be ready. Instead, Trump didn't do that. Members of Congress, in a letter in March 13th, members of Congress begging him to use it. He wouldn't use it. And worse, his tone, Ali. I mean, you've captured it so well from just 5 weeks ago, February 28th, at a rally where Donald Trump infamously said that Democrats are politicizing this virus and calling it the Democrats' new hoax. His words, a new hoax. And he went on in that rally to slam the media for media hysteria. And that media hysteria was warning of the risks of this virus. And it's not just a month ago. I want to point out March 24th, Donald Trump was on Fox News where he said we don't shut down the country over auto accidents and flu outbreaks. That was a week and a half ago. So Donald Trump continues to undermine this. And worse, Ali, I think, as well as his media allies like Sean Hannity attacking Governor Cuomo yesterday. You had Tucker Carlson slamming Dr. Fauci. To me, it's very little those two do on Fox News that are not directed by Trump or, in their mind, part of the Trump messaging. So Americans don't know what to do, who to look for, and we are less safe because of Donald Trump's failure.
Dean, it is one thing to go back to those days in February and March. On March 12th, the president was still saying this is not particularly serious. I think that might have been the first day when he said, I knew this was a pandemic before it was called a pandemic. But the fact is, some of it still continues. The minimizing still continues. Jared Kushner saying the other day that this is the federal stockpile. It's not the state stockpile. I think every American watching that, for those who were watching it, were a little surprised. We assume that when the federal government stockpiles medical supplies, oil, things like that, that would be for use by Americans. We were treated to a different interpretation by Jared Kushner at the White House. It's, oh, no, this is our federal stockpile. You states need to figure out your own stuff.
It's unreal to hear that. It's not our stockpile and that it's the Trump families or the federal government's. It's our stockpile. It is our tax dollars that paid for that, to be ready as a supplement and to help states in need. Instead, we have Governor Cuomo begging for weeks. Mayor de Blasio begging for weeks and weeks. Donald Trump used the Defense Production Act. We have Republican elected officials saying the same thing. Even Ted Cruz a few weeks ago in urging Donald Trump to use the Defense Production Act. But those supplies are there for America in need. But I want people to think about this. We would not have to be here where the governor of Oregon has to save the state of New York, or at least some lives, and China and Russia have to save us. And that generosity is great. If Donald Trump simply used all the powers of a wartime president that he claims to be, Defense Production Act, in fact, he has used the Defense Production Act before this, but this time he belittled it. And according to reporting in the New York Times, because the Chamber of Commerce, a pro-business interest group, lobbied him, don't use the Defense Production Act. It'll get in the way of corporations. For Trump, it's profits over people. And we're seeing it right here. And Ali, this goes into a bigger picture question when we get through this and we're on the other side. Do Americans trust Donald Trump with the next crisis? And I think that was not expected to be the question of 2020 election, but I think it really will be. Do you trust this man to lead us the next time it is reelected?
Dean, you'll stick with me through the course of the show. Dean Obeidallah is the host of the Dean Obeidallah Show, and he's a columnist with the Daily Beast. Dr. Rob Davidson, we're going to get him back. We're just having a little bit of trouble with his Skype connection. That happens these days. This is a new way of doing live TV. I'm in my home, and everybody's in their homes joining me from Skype, and I guess that tests the pipes out there. Let's talk a little about Italy. It's the first country in Europe to truly witness the wrath of this virus, and hopefully it is turning a corner. What can the U.S. learn from that country's experience? We're going to ask Matteo Renzi, Italy's former prime minister, when we come back. Italy is finally turning a corner in its fight against coronavirus. The situation is still critical, but the number of new cases is declining. And in a new milestone, more than 20,000 people have recovered from coronavirus. I want to go to NBC's Matt Bradley, who is live in St. Peter's Square in Rome. Matt, what's the situation there?
Well, as you can see, Ali, this is the lockdown. Holy Week is now indoors. There's no one in the square today here in St. Peter's Square. This should be packed with tens of thousands of faithful carrying, palms and olive branches. But instead, there's no one here but the police telling people to leave. And that is what we're seeing with this lockdown that's now about to enter into its 5th week next week. So this has been good. I mean, this is what we're starting to see, why we're starting to see this coming up in the numbers, even though it's been devastating for the economy. And this is a lesson for the U.S. because we're actually starting to see the effectiveness of this lockdown. We're starting to see a plateau. But, Ali, I don't want to get too optimistic. These numbers can shoot back up. They have in the past. We've seen, a couple of days with them going down. But now, as you mentioned, we are starting to see convincing evidence that the lockdown really has been working. And that's because, the policymakers were taking this very seriously. We just saw the police here. They were controlling people. They're just over behind the camera there. Looks like they're going to find somebody. They've fined tens of thousands of people, and the fines have been increasing. And that's why people are abiding by it. Even in the south of the country, where the disease, like here in Rome, hasn't been nearly as widespread as it is in the north, in Lombardy. In Lombardy, the province that is probably the most devastated place in the entire world because of this disease, they've now said that you have to wear masks every time you go outside. That's now the new local law there in the north of the country. And, you know, policymakers, they're not going to want to lift this anytime soon. We know that they're about to be lifting it probably the day after Easter. I would suspect, and a lot of people we're hearing from in the government are suspecting, that they're probably going to extend that maybe until the 1st of May. They don't want to reverse the progress, that delicate progress that they've already made. And here's the thing. In Spain, in France, and in Germany, we're starting to see the number of cases rising, still spiking. So they could see a secondary wave of infections from outside if they lift those restrictions. That's something we already saw in China and elsewhere in Asia, and Italy will not want to repeat that. Ali?
Matt, thank you for your continued coverage from Italy. It is a lesson for all of us, and Italy may be turning a corner, but it's not out of the woods yet. One of the hardest hit cities is Bergamo, and those on the front lines of the fight there have a warning for us here. We've got a full special report from our Sky News partners in London tonight. Coronavirus into the red zone, airing at 10 p.m. right here on MSNBC. And my next guest is a member of the Italian Senate, Matteo Renzi. He was also Italy's prime minister until 2016. Mr. Renzi, thank you again for being with us. Something Matt said struck me, and it's something that you have said too, and that is that reopening or beginning to get to the other side does not mean a return to normal. It does not mean reducing the vigilance. And in fact, you are quite concerned that if not handled properly, Italy could see a resurgence.
Well, first of all, good morning. But if you look at the unbelievable image of Matt explained show just some minutes ago with Piazza San Pietro in the lockdown time, I think really we are in the middle of an unbelievable emergency. But first of all, I think when we met just some days ago, when we had the first connection with you, you remember I advised, please be prudent, be safe, because the problem of Italy today will be the problem of the United States of tomorrow. And really, that happened. Now, in Italy, the situation is that we must create a new normality. Because for the next 2 years, maybe 1 year and a half, maybe 2 years and a half, we will fight against coronavirus until the vaccination, because we will be safe only in the next 18 months, 24 months. So the question today for Italy is reduce the level of hospitalization, very important, and that happened in the last days. The second point is step by step, reopen the plants, reopen the place for job, because we cannot close for 2 years a country, and then create a new normality, maybe with a mask, with the protection, with the social distancing. So we have 1 year and a half very difficult in front of us. I hope that will be not only for Italy, because this is not, now it's clear, the problem of Italy, but it's a problem of everyone around the world.
And that's why it's useful for us to sort of look at Italy as an example, given that we're seeing in Spain, we're seeing in the United States these kinds of numbers. We saw in Italy higher mortality numbers. Part of that, some people say, is because we don't actually know. It's a similar problem in the United States. We don't actually know how many people got the virus, so you can't really determine what the mortality rate is unless you know exactly how many people got the virus. Are we ever going to get to a point where we're testing the right number of people so we can determine exactly how deadly this infection is?
It's very hard, because we don't know what is really the number of the people really infected. And for that, it's important, in my view, I suggest for my people, mass screening with a new test, because if we can also discover that a lot of people maybe are infected from coronavirus, but without symptoms. And that is very important, because that means we have antibodies and we are ready to come back to normality. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot of things about this virus, but I think Italy 2 weeks ago was the only problem in the narrative around the world, and this was false. Now we have to understand that Italy has some problems different than other countries because the level of mortality in Italy is high, too high, unbelievable. And we don't know the reason, particularly in the north of Italy, Lombardia, Bergamo. You describe a very interesting report from a red zone from Bergamo. So I think this is my personal view, I'm not a doctor, to reduce the level of mortality for the next weeks and the next months, the best way is first mass screening of the people to understand if some of us are infected. Second point, very important, use technology. Because in some countries, for example, South Korea, we can check a very interesting relation between the number of people infected and a low number of died. That it's important, maybe thanks to technology. So we have to follow the science. We have to follow the suggestion, the advice of the doctors to reduce the risk. But at the same time, political decision makers have to think about the world of tomorrow, because this coronavirus is not simply a virus, is a change of era, is a change of season. And that is true also for politics, but also for economy, also for healthcare, for everything.
Matteo Renzi, thank you for joining us again. I suspect we will have more occasions to talk. Matteo Renzi is the former Prime Minister of Italy. He is now a member of the Italian Senate. One of the byproducts of the economic freeze brought on by the coronavirus pandemic is a global reduction of carbon emissions. That makes sense. Some scientists believe that the levels may drop to numbers that we have not seen since prior to World War II. Now, according to The Hill, with Americans working from home and industry slashing production, scientists at the Global Carbon Project estimate that carbon output could see a decrease of 5% or more on a year-over-year basis. On the other hand, the Trump administration is trying to roll back ambitious Obama-era vehicle emission standards, raising the ceiling on damaging fossil fuel emissions for years to come, and gutting one of the United States' biggest efforts against climate change. Joining me now is the former EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy. She's also the president and CEO of the National Resources Defense Council. Gina, good to see you again. One of the things you and I have discussed for a long time is that EPA standards, emission standards for cars are what we consider the low-hanging fruit, right? That's the easy thing that we can do. We can call for greater technology. The technology exists. The automakers are prepared to engage in it. And it's the way in which we can do something that we always do, which is drive more than any country in the world drives, and save energy while doing it. So it seems like moving backward on this is the wrong thing to do at this moment.
Well, it sure does to me, and I think to the breathing public it ought to as well. You know, I know that our attention is focused on coronavirus, and it should, but rolling back car standards is exactly the opposite of what you'd want to do to keep people healthy. So we're actually risking public health at a time when public health is the key issue that we need to advance on. Excuse me. And so, Ali, we talk a lot about these issues. The car standards that the Obama administration put out was welcomed by the car industry. These changes clearly are not. They are rolling back the requirements for pollution that keep people safe. They are rolling back our opportunity to protect public health at the very time when public health is at risk. We are also talking about a change in the standards in a way that will lose 10 to 20,000 jobs. If you care about jobs, don't go with this rollback. If you care about money, don't go with the rollback, because by their own admission, it's costing more than $20 billion more than the Obama administration actually put forward. So this doesn't make sense from any standpoint. And Ali, as we talked about all the time, this is about how you move to a better future. We should not be investing what they're doing today in polluters, in giving favors to polluters, like their non-enforcement policy, like this rule that does nothing but benefit the oil industry. What kind of future do we want? Do we want to give people better health at the time they need it and move to a future that reduces pollution, that actually causes respiratory damage for people? What are we actually going to do today? And what signal are we sending the future? Is it going to be a clean energy future? Are we going to continue to focus on fossil fuels and oil industry benefits at the risk of you and I and people? That's what the issue is at risk on climate change.
And I think one of the issues is with the drop in the price of oil, we saw it bounce back a little bit last week, but with the drop in the price of oil, gasoline prices have become much lower, which does tend to result in Americans driving more, consuming more. So we'll see a sort of an opposite effect. But you did point out that the fuel standards have resulted in a reduction of 455 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emission. That's the equivalent of about 100 million vehicles driving for a year, and saved drivers $86 billion at the pump. So the fact is, fuel emission standards, tightening fuel emission standards hurts no one. I remember years ago, Ford came up with a truck, with its F-Series truck. They redesigned it to be lighter, made of lighter materials, with a more fuel-efficient engine, and nobody driving it lost any power. If you like a big truck that goes fast and has a lot of power and can tow a lot, they were able to do that while reducing fuel emissions.
And all the owners of these big auto manufacturing companies sat on a stage with the president and with Lisa Jackson at the time, who was the administrator of EPA, and celebrated the rules that we were rolling out. Because if you remember, they were in bankruptcy. We brought them out of bankruptcy with federal dollars, and then they got to sell more cars than ever before. And year after year, they kept beating their own record. So there is no reason for this. The industry is not calling for these types of rollbacks. So you have to ask yourself, what is the administration doing? Why are they rolling these backs when it costs money, it costs jobs, it adds more air pollution at the time when we are most at risk of respiratory disease, and it impacts people in poverty and low-income people the most, people of color as well. We're not even addressing water shutoffs all over the country at a time when people need water to wash their hands. Can we focus on the needs of today and how to build a better future, and stop thinking that we can save the fossil fuel industry somehow at a time when we have to recognize that that's no longer our future? We have 3.4 million people working in clean industry today, clean energy. Let's move that forward. Let's think about where we want to head, not how we preserve the backwards movement that this administration seems to constantly be thinking about and investing in.
Former EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy. Gina, thank you for the continued conversation on this, which is one of the most important issues for all of us around. Thank you, Gina. Back in January, when the coronavirus had begun spreading in China, the West largely ignored it. The Chinese government downplayed the situation, oppressing those who spoke out, quelling dissent, refusing to give accurate numbers of those who were infected. Dr. Li Wenliang, who first warned of the potential coronavirus back in December of 2019, was told to recant, to stay quiet and not cause alarm. Eventually, he died of the virus himself as the situation continued to worsen. The Chinese people themselves are not to blame at all here. They were lied to by their own government, told that things were under control when they weren't. Chinese Premier Xi Jinping has been praised for how he handled the virus, despite weeks of underreporting numbers until it was too big to keep quiet. Organizations like the World Health Organization refused to call the situation in China a global health emergency, instead, shockingly, praising Xi for his transparency. Over the last 30 years, as the Chinese government has grown in power and economic dominance, the ability to hold it accountable has diminished. With the world depending on China, there is little room for criticism of its actions. We know that the Chinese government has squelched dissidents, has arrested local journalists and in the wake of coronavirus kicked out foreign journalists, including some from America. We have known for years that China has a tendency to conceal information in order to maintain control. We've seen them go head-to-head in brutal protests with citizens in Hong Kong. We've seen the mistreatment of minority groups. And yet, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and even our own president have applauded China's handling of coronavirus, despite knowing that things are not as they seem. A recent U.S. intel report confirmed what many China experts had warned, that China continues to downplay the scope of the virus, concealing the number of cases and deaths. Now, this set a dangerous precedent, degrading science and truth in favor of control and political expediency. China is apparently getting back to normal. Factories are getting started again, and life may perhaps continue as before, except that it can't. Because this time, those lies have brought much of the world to a standstill. China's government must be held to account, if not for all who have been wronged, then for the preservation of truth in science and in fact. Trust in our leaders and our healthcare providers has diminished at its most critical moment. It is more necessary than ever for us to push for the truth that we need to stay safe. The coronavirus has been shown to disproportionately infect and kill more men than women, but experts warn that women may be affected by the virus in other ways. Women in the United States dominate both healthcare and caretaker positions, so despite their lower rates of infection, women are the majority of the nation's frontline workers. Now, according to a Gallup survey, women, even those in the workforce, were carrying the brunt of household and caretaking chores, and traditional gender roles among heterosexual couples are largely adhered to in the United States. Helen Lewis wrote in The Atlantic that one of the most striking effects of the coronavirus will be to send many couples back to the 1950s. Across the world, women's independence will be a silent victim of the pandemic. Health crises also tend to have a negative effect on women's rights and independence. Stressful situations and financial struggles lead to a rise in domestic violence. Quarantines make it difficult for women to report their abusers. Diversion of medical care leads to a higher rate of deaths during childbirth and a lack of access to birth control. Women who lose work during pandemics take longer to get rehired. With me now to discuss this further is David Miliband. He's the CEO of the International Rescue Committee. David, thank you for joining us. One of the things you've been able to do for our viewers is sort of make us aware on a global scale of some of the things that are not entirely clear to us. We spend our days thinking about respirators and masks and rates of infection and rates of mortality, but there are people on the edges of society globally who will feel the effects of this harder today and for time to come. And one of them you pointed out is women.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ali. The International Rescue Committee is a global humanitarian organization, so we're working in the world's war zones, in the refugee hosting states. And the statistics that you've just flashed up about the threat to women in America is magnified many times in the places where we work. We know that women are about 75% of those who are affected, who flee as a result of war. We know that they are the large majority of those who take up caring, nursing roles in the communities in which we work. And we know that they are especially exposed to higher levels of violence that you rightly referenced. We've been calling on the international community to use this short period of time before this pandemic hits the most vulnerable around the world to take preventative action, to set up the hand washing stations, to set up the triaging facilities, to make sure there is the fever testing. And of course, there would be disproportionate benefit to women and girls if this preventative action could be taken. I'm sad to report to you, a week after having been on your show, we're still struggling to get that global perspective that is so important.
Right, and you did point out rightfully that this has still mostly affected the developed world. It is starting to make its way. We've seen instances of these in some camps. We've seen it in Gaza. But in a lot of these developing countries, what we have also learned is the best way to implement broader education or broader primary health or primary education is through educating women in these areas or empowering women to do things. We found that in the world of microfinance. finance, that women do particularly well on these areas because a woman is central, particularly in the developing world, to a family's existence. So that is also a structural problem. If more women get infected and or die, you see family units breaking up and you see greater poverty setting in.
I think you're making a vital point. I would say two things are absolutely critical. First of all, the community makers in these displaced communities are often women, and community making is not just about homemaking, it's about the economy, it's about education, it's about, frankly, the future of the next generation. The second element that's absolutely key is the way in which caring responsibilities are distributed. And of course, the structures of power in many of the places that we work are deeply unequal. They're deeply injurious to the life chances of women. And we fear that the 13, 14, and 15-year-olds who are sold off for marriage, that the girls who started school but then aren't able to restart if and when the schools are reopened, these are the challenges that are magnified in the humanitarian emergencies around the world. I also have to say that although the international community, through the United Nations, set aspirational, sustainable development goals 5 years ago, the gender gap in too many aspects is increasing. Just to give you the example of education, the progress towards universal primary education has been stalled in the last 3 or 4 years, and young girls are bearing the greatest brunt of that.
I want to bring in Sally Engel-Mary. She's an NYU professor of anthropology. She's the author of a book, Human Rights and Gender Violence. Sally, earlier in the week, I spoke to somebody about the effects here in the United States and in the developed world on domestic violence of women who now have less freedom to be able to leave a situation, or who can sort of spend their workday away from a potentially abusive partner, who can't do that now, who might be sheltered in place with them in a time when shelters are less available and services are less available. There's some interesting things happening in the world. In France, we saw a report in CNN that women are using code words at pharmacies to escape domestic violence. A pharmacy inspired by a scheme in Spain, pharmacies have been telling victims to head to drugstores. If they can't talk openly, they can use a code word, mask 19, to the pharmacist behind the counter. So these problems of the diminishing of women and their roles in society are exacerbated in crises like this. They're not helped.
No, that's absolutely right. There are many reasons for thinking this effect of the coronavirus is going to make the problem of gender-based violence far worse than it already is. Many of the ways we've put protections in place for women over the last 40 years are no longer so functioning. The police, the courts, shelters, which means that women are going to be much more likely to be captured, caught in small spaces with abusers and unable to escape. One of the important dimensions of violence against women is that it's typically caused not just by the patriarchal structures of society, which clearly privilege men, and of course added strength privileges men's violence, but also that very often domestic violence is inspired by a sense of vulnerability and insecurity that men feel about their ability to manage. It's very closely related to poverty and economic crises, so that having greater economic difficulties is going to make this problem much worse. And often the batterer is afraid that he's going to lose his partner, that he depends on this woman and he needs her. And so the strategy is usually to use forms of humiliation and degradation and name-calling before the violence actually starts. And this should be a warning sign to women if they have any way of escaping that. Once this begins, then violence typically follows. And I think the problems of having, say, furniture just repossessed or losing a car is going to make the batterer's desire for isolating the woman and subjecting her to his controlling behavior is going to be much worse. Of course, the other factor that exacerbates this problem is alcohol, and insofar as people are turning to that for comfort in this time of real anxiety, it's going to be another contributing factor. So that there's every reason for thinking this problem is going to get worse, and the solutions for exit for women are going to be significantly diminished.
Thank you to both of you for shining a light on an important issue of the situation of this virus and how it affects different people differently, particularly women. David Miliband is the CEO of the International Rescue Committee. Sally Engel-Mary is an NYU professor of anthropology and the author of the book Human Rights and Gender Violence. Thank you to both of you. At the top of the hour, we're going to take you to the Jacob Javits Center in New York City, best known for its comic conventions and car shows. It's now a makeshift hospital for COVID-19 patients. Velshi continues after this.